Taking a look at the world's richest countries, they basically all fit into one of three categories: tax havens, financial capitals, or oil autocracies. And then there's Norway. This tiny Nordic nation spends more on welfare than almost any other country on Earth, nearly twice as much per person as the UK, Spain, or Japan. It's famous for its high taxes. 41 of every 100 krone earned goes straight to the government. But despite the sizable tax burden, the country is extremely rich. The average Norwegian earns more than $87,000 a year. That's the fourth highest in the world. And today, Norway is hailed as the gold standard of democratic socialism.
We should look to countries like Denmark, like Sweden, and Norway, and learn from what they have accomplished for their working people.
The Nordic Model is held up as proof that big government and high taxes can work. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time in the 1990s when the country was heralded as one of the most radical neoliberal reformers. Even today, Norway ranks 10th globally for economic freedom, higher than the UK, Japan, and even the US. Plus, it's home to the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, with over $1.8 trillion invested across global markets. So what's actually going on here? Can Norway really claim to be a socialist utopia? Or is it more capitalist than popular imagination seems to think? To truly understand what's going on in the Norwegian economy, we need to go back to a time when the world looked very different, the 1950s. Across the Atlantic, the United States was booming, and Western Europe was quickly reindustrializing. Things in Norway looked very different. The country had never really built up an industrial base. Instead, its economy relied on basic agricultural outputs, like fishing and farming. By the 1950s, it was starting to lag behind its Western European counterparts. While the rest of Europe raced into the modern industrial age, Norway remained stuck in the past. Then, in 1949, the Labour Party was elected to government on a mandate for radical change. Their plan was simple: transform Norway into a modern industrial economy by putting the state at the centre of everything, nationalise key sectors, tightly regulate private enterprise, and use public spending to drive growth. For 16 years straight, the Labour Party held an absolute majority, completely reshaping the country's economy. And for a while, it worked. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the country's economy grew by over 165%. That's faster than the UK, Australia, and even the US. But there was a problem. Thanks to being sheltered from market competition, state-run enterprises gradually became less and less efficient. Government-owned enterprises were totally insulated from market pressures, and without the threat of bankruptcy or shareholder revolt, inefficiencies were tolerated and mismanagement often went unchecked. Projects repeatedly went billions over budget, with project costs spiralling out of control, and slowly the system began to crumble. At the start of the 1970s, inflation spiked, reaching 10% for the first time in decades. All the while, the country's rate of economic growth slowed to zero. From there, things only got worse. In an effort to prop up these failing companies, the government printed huge sums of money, but this only fueled the inflationary spiral. Through the 1970s, the country experienced an average inflation rate of more than 9%. For ordinary Norwegians, this was devastating. The cost of living surged, food prices doubled, electricity bills skyrocketed, rents rose faster than wages could keep up. Families saw their savings eroded, and strikes broke out across major industries as workers demanded pay rises just to keep up with the cost of essentials. The country was slowly falling apart. By the end of the 1970s, it was clear that the old system wasn't working anymore. The country needed a new direction. The government slowly began implementing a series of radical reforms, totally reshaping the country's economy. It started with deregulating the banking system. Interest rate caps were scrapped, restrictions on banks and insurers lifted, and, for the first time, foreign banks were allowed in, unleashing a wave of market-driven competition. Next came privatization. Over the course of a decade, the government sold off steel, aluminium, rail, and even parts of oil and gas. And in 1992, the government implemented a series of radical tax cuts. The total rate of corporation tax was cut in half, from 52% to 28%, the biggest cut seen in the country's history. Slowly but surely, the Norwegian economy got back on track. Inflation came under control, investment poured in, unemployment fell, and for the first time in decades, private businesses began to flourish. From 1990 to 2010, the country enjoyed one of the fastest rates of economic growth in the world. Average incomes had increased by over 170%. By the 2010s, the average Norwegian was earning $30,000, more than the average American worker every year. In the span of a few short decades, the country had gone from the midst of a crisis to being considered a model economy, one which countries around the world try to emulate. Now, the reform of the 1980s played a key role in this. They restored market discipline, revitalized private enterprise, and reined in the runaway inflation that had crippled the country for a decade. But the country is far from being a free market paradise. After all, it has one of the highest tax rates in the world. 41% of every krone earned goes straight to the government. Money that is then used to fund things like healthcare, higher education, and paid parental leave. But here's the thing. Norway's tax system is radically different to that of other Western countries, and it might not be in the way that you expect. Top rate of tax in Norway is just 38%, far lower than the UK's 45% rate top band. But this lower rate of tax is compensated for the fact that a far larger percentage of the population falls into the top tax bracket. In Norway, a person only needs to be earning 1.5 times the national average to find themselves in the top bracket. In the UK, on the other hand, entering into the top bracket requires earning 2.5 times the national average. In the US, that number rises to 8.5 times. The point is, Norway funds its generous welfare state not by heavily taxing the super rich, but by taxing everybody. While people often imagine the country's services being funded through a progressive tax system, the country actually does the opposite. It also relies heavily on VAT, the tax placed on the sale of goods and services to raise revenue. About 9% of Norway's GDP goes to VAT, far higher than the 6% in the UK and only 2% in the US. This is a tax which, regardless of income levels, everybody pays the same amount, a far cry from the socialist image often forced onto the country. All in all, Norway actually has one of the least progressive taxation systems in the developed world. Yes, the country has very high levels of taxes, even despite the reforms in the 1990s. However, these high levels of tax are paid for by everybody. Government services are almost entirely funded by the middle class. But there's another crucial reason why Norway is able to sustain such an expensive welfare state. One that goes far beyond taxation policy, and one which can't be so easily copied by other nations. Oil. Norway is situated on one of the world's largest natural depositories. Since it was discovered in the 1960s, it has contributed about $2.25 trillion to the Norwegian economy. That's over $325,000 per person. Today, about 20% of the country's GDP comes from the oil industry. But here's the thing. While other countries that discovered oil reserves quickly wasted the cash on overpriced infrastructure projects or unsustainable tax cuts, Norway took a different approach. It wouldn't spend the oil money, it would invest it. And thanks to this, the country now owns the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. The fund holds an average 1.5% of every listed company on Earth. From Apple and Microsoft to Nestle and Samsung, chances are, if you've heard of a major global corporation, Norway owns a piece of it. The fund now holds over $1.8 trillion in global assets. That's more than $330,000 per citizen. And, critically, it doesn't invest in Norway itself. Why? Well, if they were to do so, companies would quickly try to buy influence. Suddenly, every major corporation would have a reason to cozy up to politicians, lobbying for favorable deals, pushing for investments in their own industries, or pressuring officials to prioritize certain regions or projects. Instead, the fund exclusively invests in foreign companies, and this policy has transformed the fund into the country's biggest asset. Today, The fund accounts for 20% of the government's annual budget. That means a fifth of government spending doesn't come from taxation, but investments from the past. For context, that's enough to cover the country's entire healthcare budget, with a few billion to spare. Of course, a multi-trillion-dollar international investment sign isn't exactly textbook socialism. But more importantly, it raises questions about the extent to which the Norwegian system should be taken as a model of economic success. After all, very few countries are fortunate enough to be sitting on trillions of dollars worth of oil reserves, much less an investment fund worth over $300,000 per person. Yet, it is in large part through this investment fund that the country is able to fund the social programs that it's famous for. So, where does that leave us? Well, for all the praise Norway receives as a shining example of democratic socialism, the truth is a little more complicated. Yes, the country offers generous social programs, universal healthcare, and free higher education, the kinds of policies often associated with the left. But these services aren't funded the way many people think. They're paid for not by soaking the rich, but by heavily taxing the middle class and relying on broad-based consumption taxes like VAT. And, crucially, a massive portion of public spending is underwritten by profits from global capitalism, in the form of a $1.8 trillion sovereign wealth fund built on decades of oil exports and smart investment policy. Norway didn't build a social state despite embracing the market, it built one through it. And that makes it very different from the romantic image often projected onto it by advocates of democratic socialism. And at the same time, Norway's model isn't exactly easy to replicate. Most countries don't have oceans of oil, and fewer still have the discipline or political will to invest that wealth for the long term, rather than spending it up front. So while there's a lot to admire in the Norwegian system, such as its efficiency, its transparency, its combination of market freedom and social guarantees, it's not a one-size-fits-all template. In the end, Norway isn't proof that socialism works. It's proof that pragmatism works. That when a country blends smart economic management with a long-term vision, it can build a system that works.